This lecture introduces the High Renaissance with the transitional figure of Leonardo da Vinci, the artist who would bridge the gap between the later 15th century, or Quattrocento, and the early 16th century, and the other two High Renaissance masters you're probably familiar with, Michelangelo and Raphael. In addition to Leonardo, we'll also cover Bramante, the architect who worked in Rome for Julius II and designed the new version of the Vatican and new St. Peter's as you now see it. The High Renaissance roughly is going to cover the period between 1500 to 1520. It is a very narrow window in which we have an immense amount of activity occurring with a few very important artists leading these innovations, the first and foremost among them being Leonardo da Vinci, or Leonard from the town of Vinci, because he was born in a small town outside of Florence, but still in the control of Florence and in their respective area. Now, he was trained quite late by Andrea del Verrocchio, or Andrew of the True Eye is his nickname, a very popular sculptor and painter in the mid and late 15th century in Florence. Now, Leonardo, as you may know, is going to be known for his investigations into the natural world, specifically into hydraulics, into anatomy, into optics, and various other branches of science. And this, of course, is going to be because he rejected all prior authority. Just because it was written does not mean that he accepted it. He needed to actually experiment, hypothesize, and then carry out these ideas himself. And so he studies independently for a good portion of his life and did not even consider himself an artist, interestingly enough. Now, the experiments that Leonardo is famous for also are carried out in his paintings as well. One of the most famous of which, and one of the most copied and popularly known, can be found today in Milan. So in Milan, you have the Duchy, actually, of Milan, not a republic like Florence, and the Duke of Milan ruling it. And he is very concerned about the Kingdom of France to his west and the Holy Roman Empire that butts up against his duchy in the north. So he's always on the lookout for good military and civil engineers. But while he was up here with the Duke as an engineer, he did have time to take on certain commissions, though very often he did not finish them. One of the examples can be found in Santa Maria delle Grazie, or Saint Mary of Grace in Milan. It is here in a monastery that the first High Renaissance wall painting is going to still be seen today, in the refectory. And as we discussed, the refectories are going to be cafeterias in monasteries where monks would gather to eat several times a day. Therefore, the most appropriate subject from the life of Christ would have been the last time that he and the apostles were together feasting before the crucifixion. All right, so as the first High Renaissance wall painting, we must consider how important this work is, because it introduces a series of ideal figures set in an ideal space beyond our own. It does not connect, right, as far as the space is concerned in linear perspective with us, and the figures are too perfect to inhabit our world, engaged in their own, and involved in a type of chaotic, cacophonous ballet that people so appreciate. Now, if you look at the area around the fresco, which is in the center, it is all white because it was rebuilt. Unfortunately, the Allies in World War II were trying to bomb a Nazi railway station and shipping yard next to the monastery in 1943. And the bombs, of course, drifted and nearly destroyed all of this monastery. Luckily, as you see in this photograph here, the monks knew of the impending attack and sandbagged the fresco. So it does survive, though none of the original refectory, except for the left wall you see here, survives intact today. Now, Despite the explosions and the destruction that took place here in World War II, that did not do the majority of the damage to this fresco. It was, in fact, Leonardo himself who caused the majority of the damage that caused the fresco to flake off. If you see at the bottom, there is a door that the monks later cut into the fresco. This was not part of the original design. And you can see the figures are somewhat hazy and blurry because Leonardo da Vinci did not paint in pure buon fresco technique on wet lime plaster. Instead, he experimented, adding tempera, which is the egg-based medium, and oil paint, an oil-based medium, on it. And as you might imagine, if you're going to paint on wet plaster and add oil on top of it, that's going to repel moisture. When it started to dry and the moisture tried to escape the wall, it pushed on the oil which was on the surface, thus flaking off. So it was already in a state of disrepair by the time the great artist biographer Giorgio Vasari came to see it in his own lifetime, just nearly 20 years later. Now, what makes the painting, despite its poor state, so important is the organization. And the organization departs from the standard Tuscan Last Supper that we discussed with Andrea del Castagno, which almost always will find Judas set off on the other side of the table. So then the question becomes, where's Waldo? And that's exactly what Leonardo wanted his audience, the monks that are looking at this, to do, is search through each individual figure who acts idiosyncratically, individually, and emotionally to Christ's announcement, as we discussed earlier with the Last Supper by Castagno, that someone will betray him. All right, so they all are looking to one another, trying to discover who the traitor will be. All right, so instead of merely having Judas clearly on the other side and easy to determine who they are, he instead is going to put Judas on the same side of the table and identifies him because he is the only one who is dark-skinned, thus showing how evil he is with this evil physiognomy. And he holds a bag of money in his right hand and is the only one to reach for food. He's the only one who does not protest this accusation that someone will betray him and instead continues to eat. Now, with the figures on the right side of the table, or all on the same side of the table, we have solved the old Last Supper dilemma, which is to state, how do you see 12 people at the same time and have it look natural? Because obviously, in any type of large banquet, you're not going to sit only on one side of the table. So what Leonardo does is unifies the composition mathematically and, of course, compositionally. So number one, you'll notice he's going to very clearly lay out the perspectival system with the orthogonals in the ceiling tiles and on the walls with these tapestries, as well as the windows behind Christ. So you find that even though we have all of these various figures that are moving in waves away from Christ and turning towards one another in different fashions, they could be entirely chaotic. But we have anchoring the composition again, a very stable shape, that pyramidal composition that we discussed. A triangle anchors the center of the composition where we have the vanishing point, where all the orthogonal lines converge, which is Christ's head, which is infinity. Now, if you look at Christ, we have the traditional androgynous, rather idealized and effeminate style by Leonardo da Vinci used. So he likes or prefers long hair, soft feminine features, and you get an indication here of how much is actually flaked off and what really remains of what Leonardo himself painted. Because, of course, we went back over this painting nearly a half dozen times since Leonardo finished it, trying to restore it. But today we prefer to conserve rather than restore. We want to see only what the original artist painted, not what later 19th century restorers added to it. Now, the vanishing point, even though it is on Christ's head, there is no way that you could possibly have someone's line of sight line up with it. That being, they cannot be standing anywhere in the cafeteria, this refectory, and line up with the vanishing point. So we have now no longer a need to connect to the viewer as far as their space is concerned. Instead, we're going to have an ideal space that is going to be self-contained and sufficient, but also, like that of Castagna's, an image that is relevant anywhere in the cafeteria because it does not rely on your location. Now, that's not the only way that Leonardo suggests a type of controlled chaos, if you were here. He is going to balance them with motion and emotion. So thereby, all the figures, aside from Christ, who is the calm eye of the storm, are going to be emotionally engaged in arguments with one another, trying to ascertain which one of them will betray Christ. But there is another way that he actually organizes them, and that is through mathematical unity. He's going to group the apostles into 4 groups of 3, thus of course giving us 12. Right? So you must then think like a monk who considers theological tracts all day and numerically what that might mean. So yes, it balances them by having a bilaterally symmetrical composition with the same number of figures on either side grouped together, thus controlling the interactions of each triptych, each 3 figures. Right, so let's look behind Christ. He is the second person of the Trinity. Therefore, you have him being the second window. So you have the Father, the Son, which is Christ in the center, and the Holy Ghost. So we have 3 referenced again here, as well as the 3s that the apostles are grouped in. So what are there 3 of? Well, any monk at this time would have an easy time identifying what there are 3 of and 4 of, but we need to go well beyond that. First, we must note that there are 3 parts to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. There are 3 theological virtues, and then they're grouped into, again, 4 groups of 3. So what are there 4 of? There are 4 elements, there are 4 gospels, there are 4 cardinal virtues, there are 4 rivers of paradise, seasons, times of day. The correspondences continue. But again, that is simple. What would monks then, who consider all of these very complex theological issues, think about when you started adding and multiplying? What are there 3 plus 4 of? 7, right? So what are there 7 of? There are 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. There are 7 joys of the Virgin. There are 7 sorrows of the Virgin. What are the 3 times 4, or 12 of? There are 12 apostles, as you see here. There are 12 gates of New Jerusalem, 12 months, 12 hours of the day, 12 hours of the night, right? And so the correspondences continue. We can move even further into this interpretation, and you might think that we are going a bit far in the symbolism encoded here by Leonardo, but the fact is we are not even close to understanding the layers of complex numerological symbolism that Leonardo added to it. Through letters and correspondence, we know that contemporaries considered this a very simplistic interpretation that I'm giving you here. It is even more complicated. Let us now turn to the Mona Lisa, arguably the most famous painting in the world, located in the Louvre, where thousands of people flock to see it on a daily basis to take their picture and then leave. Now, the Mona Lisa wasn't always the most famous painting in the world. It was actually stolen in the early 20th century, and the headlines made it the most famous painting. From Japan to America, all over Europe, Central and South America, everyone heard of this famous heist. But what is the Mona Lisa itself? The Mona Lisa is a portrait of a patrician or upper middle class Florentine woman. She is dressed in the attire of a married woman at the time with a veil. Very vaguely you can see the veil over her forehead covering her hair, telling us that she is married. She's also wearing very fashionable attire for the early 16th century, in which they prefer to wear monochromatic blacks and somber colors. Now, off to the side, you see there are pieces to this balustrade because the painting is actually oil on panel, that being it's on wood, and it's been cut down. It's been cut down because Leonardo took this with him to France at the end of his life to work for King Francis I, and this wound up in the French collection. So it belongs to the French because Leonardo took it with him. And the French king put it in his toilet, so he would look at this every day. Now, what is unusual about the Mona Lisa, and that's why it is so enigmatic and why we know so very little about it, it was cut down, yes, so we don't know exactly what the rest of the painting necessarily looked like, and he also worked on it over a period of 3 years. Now, this is unusual if, in fact, this was a commissioned portrait that he would be paid to produce and then give to a patron. So you wouldn't work on a portrait for 3 years, right? You wouldn't be paid. And he took it with him, therefore it had some personal meaning and significance to him. Now, we also can't identify exactly who this lady is because we don't have any indication of status. That being, traditionally you will have heraldic symbols in the painting, such as the crest of the family, and on the clothing, on the sleeves of women, you would have stitched in and brocaded, wonderfully designed fashion, the heraldic device for the family as well, such as the Medici, the Albizzi, right, the Strozzi. These are all famous Florentine wealthy families. Now, why is it actually called the Mona Lisa, though? Well, you need to know that Giorgio Vasari, the famous biographer who wrote the biographies of all of these Renaissance artists, is going to state that Leonardo painted a portrait for a merchant named Giocondo, and this woman's name was Lisa. So you find that Mona is a contraction of Madonna. We always say Madonna for the Virgin Mary. It just means my lady. It's a greeting. So this in turn adopted the name My Lady Lisa, Mona Lisa, right? So, but do we know this is actually going to be Lisa di Antonio Maria Gherardini? We do not know this is actually going to be Gherardini. We do not know if this is the painting that Vasari was considering, but Italians to this day refer to this painting as La Gioconda, that being the wife of Giocondo. Now, what makes this painting so different from the portraits we see before is that, number one, the woman is looking out at the viewer. Number two, she is likely not deceased. And number three, the clothing and background do not tie to her family status and where we are. So you find here is a famous earlier example by Piero della Francesca, the portrait of Battista Sforza. So this is going to be commissioned upon the death of Battista Sforza. Very common in the 15th century. Women only had portraits made of them after they were dead. So here we see her in profile. She does not look at us. She looks away. Behind her, we can see the land that the Duke of Urbino, her husband, is going to own. So we know exactly where we are. And the sleeves, you'll notice, are going to have the heraldic devices of the Sforza family. So we know who she was married to, all of which indicate who her husband and her family were. In the Mona Lisa, we get none of that. We don't have a carefully identified and brocaded sleeve, which tells us who Lisa here is married to. The background is a very enigmatic, craggy, rocky outcropping that Leonardo prefers in the background of most of his paintings, especially landscapes, supposedly left over from his trip to the Alps, where he marveled the alpine landscape. So you have the characteristic sfumato in the background blending into this hazy fog. Now, this was originally 3/4 length, so just to show you, in another one of his paintings, Ginevra da Vinci, in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., you would have had a better indication as to how long it was, right? So the hands are going to communicate aristocratic elegance and education and how she is in control of her passions. She turns slightly to look out at the viewer, but in a coy fashion. You notice that both of these women are not fully facing or frontally facing the viewer, because that would be masculine and challenging. It would not be effeminate and somewhat passive. All right, so we find that this is an interesting twisting. It's one of the more activated approaches to, again, paintings. you will notice that the lower part of her body is in a chair. So she is seated with her body facing to the left, yet she twists off to the right. Thus we have this wonderful contortion or activation in space, as we saw with his Last Supper, with figures moving and turning and engaging with one another in different ways. So again, if you look carefully at the Mona Lisa, she has a very high brow and lacks eyebrows, which was the French tradition that we discussed going back to Jean Foucault and the melon diptych that he made for Etienne Chevalier. Women would pluck their brows very high, thus they were high brow, and it took a good deal of effort to do this on a daily basis. Thus you also find that eyebrows were very often thinned out as well. That being big, full eyebrows were not considered to be aristocratic or of the patrician class. But if you look into the background, you can see everything that is characteristic of Leonardo with the sfumato, the very gentle, hazy, smoky light that transitions. There are no hard lines. We're going to gently transition in all of the shadows from Mona Lisa's face and in the background from one shade to another. Turning to Rome, we find that the High Renaissance is largely due to one man's patronage, and that's going to be the new pope which is going to take over, and that's Julius II. He is responsible for commissioning of the Sistine Chapel, he is responsible for building new St. Peter's, and having Raphael decorate the Vatican stanze, or papal apartments. So here in Rome, we have the location for the first major Christian basilica for Pope Sylvester that Constantine had built on the west bank of the Tiber River outside of Old Rome. And it is going to be this structure that needs replacing at this time. But first, let us look at a small structure just to the southeast of St. Peter's, and that is called San Pietro in Montorio, or the Tempietto as it's more popularly known, the Little Temple. So this is going to be the small structure that catches the eye or gets the attention of Julius II for his new massive cathedral that you will see today at the Vatican. Right, so here is what we eventually are going to rebuild, right, St. Peter's and Vatican. So Julius II is going to be the pope behind this new construction project, and he's known as the warrior pope because he defies convention. Famously, he's going to ride into battle with his troops himself. He is going to grow a beard in defiance of convention. No popes grew beards, right, since Constantine. So he starts growing beards, so other popes follow him after that. He also is going to curse like a sailor. He is going to argue with his cardinals. If they did not support him, he would beat them, right, literally with canes and curse at them. But his strong personality is going to reflect what he wishes to portray the papacy as, and that is the new Roman Empire. And therefore, he is the new Roman emperor. So he selects the name Julius. So popes, when they take office, have standard names, right? John, Jacob, Smith, all of these standard names. But they're going to adopt a papal name. So what name they choose will tell you what type of pope they want to become. And in the case of Julius II, he wants to be a Roman emperor. Right, so he's going to commission everything that we know of as famously high Renaissance, right, that you think of in Rome. So the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican stanze, the massive tomb for Julius II that Michelangelo is commissioned for. Right, so why is he going to be drawn and or compelled to create these massive works which are bigger and more grand than anyone had attempted since ancient Rome? And the answer to that is the culmination of humanism, that being this belief adopted and resurrected from antiquity that humans can be understood as significant, as having intellectual and physical power to conquer and control their worlds. And so this is the ultimate expression of that kind of monumental, heroic approach to humanism in which men are like gods. You'll see that they are like superheroes in the commissions imagined by Julius II. And he wants to emulate ancient Rome and antiquity in his works, thus to establish a new Roman Empire, and he attempts to conquer various provinces to expand his empire. Just like the Roman emperors before him, he wants to ensure that the people at the time look at these ancient Roman monuments and then turn to his own monuments and compare them, as he should be compared to people like the first emperor here, Augustus. Now, he needs inspiration for this, so you find that Donato Bramante is going to be already working on and completing a small martyrium for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Now, a martyrium is not where a martyr or someone who died for the Christian faith is buried. It is where they were killed, where they were martyred, literally. So in this case, you have the the place of martyrdom where St. Peter himself, the first pope, was crucified upside down because he stated he was not worthy to be killed like Christ. So the Tempietto, or Little Temple here, as it becomes known, is going to become the model for New St. Peter's as far as the design. Right here we find it in miniature. And it is the vocabulary and the theory behind it that catches Julius II's eye. Right, so you find that it is a central plan, right? So here we have the plans on the right you see from Sebastiano Serlio that he publishes in his book. So it is a centralized plan. It's a circular design with a hemispherical dome. Right? So this little temple literally reminded people of ancient Greco-Roman temples, like those you would find around in Rome, such as the Temple of Hercules. Now, it would have been enclosed within, in the original plan, a circular courtyard that would have been framed inside of a square. Now, we must understand the significance before moving on of the circle and the square because it is so central to all architecture moving forward that was adopted and inspired by Vitruvius, the Roman architect, and antiquity. So circles and squares are the basic building blocks of the universe. This is going to be the obsession of many artists who have dreamt of making a centralized plan for a church or a structure, such as we have painted here by Raphael. We have several studies for centrally planned structures by Leonardo da Vinci. All of them are obsessed with this central plan, but why? Why are they obsessed with it? Well, here we have another painting just to show you by Perugino with Christ delivering the keys to the kingdom of heaven and earth to St. Peter, with the central plan again right here in the center between two ancient Roman triumphal arches. Right, so the explanation can be found in one of the most famous drawings in all of history, that being the Vitruvian Man, copied ad nauseum, you've seen all over the place. The Vitruvian Man is named as such because it illustrates the ideas of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who's going to state that man is a microcosmic map of the universe. So if you outstretched a man's arms and legs, Vitruvius states, this architect from Rome states, that you will have a perfect square framed inside a perfect circle. Leonardo here tries to illustrate that principle. Therefore, when architects like Donato Bramante try to design a circle in a square, they are also commenting on this idea of a map of the universe. Now, this can be understood that the Earth is a square. You can think of the four corners of the Earth, right? So this is going to be representing our terrestrial realm where we live. The circle references the dome of the heavens and eternity. So both of those brought together reference the whole of the universe. Now, when we start designing structures after this, they were doing this earlier with architects like Brunelleschi, in which you're going to have the circle and square plan. You're trying to encapsulate God's plan for the universe in a microcosmic fashion in a structure that we can then appreciate for its mathematical harmony and beauty. All right, so just to show you here again, Vitruvius is going to state that if you take a compass and use the central of a man's navel, that radiating outward would actually give you the design for a circle and square. Therefore, man is a microcosm for the macrocosm, or man is a microcosmic reflection of the universe because God created man in his image. Therefore, he imprinted or gave us the map to the universe in our own bodies. Now, this structure is immediately noticed by Julius II, and it has the message that Julius wants to convey, that is using ancient Roman vocabulary for architecture. This is a Doric order temple, and using the symbolism from ancient Rome to show that the new Roman Catholicism is the inheritor of the Roman Empire, and thus he is the new Roman emperor. Now here is St. Peter's in Vatican City as you know it today. But it's going to take over 200 years to get to this state, with the entire piazza out front, the dome on top, and the various sculptures that ring the courtyard around the Egyptian obelisk in the center with the fountains off to each side. At the time, if you've seen in shows such as the Borgia series on Showtime, we would have had a wooden structure that stood. And this wooden structure was the first design by Constantine that would be proliferated all around the Roman Empire, or the old Roman Empire, after its fall. And it's going to have a hall design with a massive interior nave. Now, this longitudinal plan is going to have a vertical, long longitudinal axis, and this area in the center is where the congregation or laity, that would be where we would be standing. This is called the nave because it looks like an upside-down ship to them. So nave in Latin is where we get that. Flanking it, you will have side aisles. So you find that in early Christian church services, people would be divided by class and race and gender. So you find that slaves and women would be off to the side, while free men generally would be in the center. Crossing the nave, you're going to have the transept, which gives you the characteristic T-shaped crossing bar, or the Latin cross design that you're so familiar with in Western Christian churches. And this is called the transept. Where the transept crosses the nave is known as the crossing, right? So this is generally the unit of space used to design and measure out the rest of the structure. All right, so these are the primary vocabulary terms used for all Christian churches up until today that you should be familiar with. At the top of the crossing, you'll often have a semicircular recess here, which is called an apse, right? So very often you'll find the choir or the high altar near the apse. All right, so this is what we call a Latin cross plan, because you have an elongated longitudinal axis and a shorter transept. Now, if we look at the plan Bramante is going to design for New St. Peter's for Julius II, and the corresponding coin to the right showing us what it would have eventually looked like had it been finished by its original designer, you can see that it is not a Latin cross plan, but instead the arms are equidistant. This is instead a Greek cross plan. Right, so this Greek cross plan would have had a central hemispherical dome in the center, which you see here in the coin, with radiating half domes off to the side. Right, so you can see that we would have had radiating half domes surrounding it. But you retain that plan from the Tintoretto, which is going to be circles in squares. Circles in squares repeated throughout this plan, which is a giant circle in a square. So this is your Greek cross plan, which has equidistant arms, named for the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians in the East, and the structures like Hagia Sophia or San Vitale in Ravenna we discussed in the first section of survey, where they will have centrally planned churches because their church services and requirements, their liturgical requirements are different than that in the Roman Catholic West. Right, so here we're going to have an example of the type of structures with a central dome and radiating half domes, and that's going to be Hagia Sophia, one of the most famous Eastern Orthodox churches that was converted to a mosque by the Turks in 1453 when they conquered Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. Now, when asked what the final structure would look like, Bramante stated that he would take the dome of the Pantheon and put it on the Basilica Nova. Remember, the Basilica Nova is going to be commissioned by Constantine. So these are two ancient Roman imperial structures he's referencing, which will create this new St. Peter's. So it is very clear, given that he is referencing and is adopting vocabulary and referencing structures in Rome that people could go see, that in fact Julius II was trying to carry out this vision of himself and of Roman Catholicism as renewing the Roman Empire. Right, so again, we find that Julius II is going to name himself after Julius Caesar. Hence, you're going to have this notion of him as a Roman emperor, and he likens himself directly to Constantine by referencing the Basilica Nova when designing this new St. Peter's. Now, the structure did not get completed as Bramante had planned, and so if we want to know what it would have looked like, we need to turn again here to Santa Maria della Consolazione in Todi. So Santa Maria here is going to roughly approximate the original plan by Bramante, which was a centrally planned structure, which is Greek cross in design with a hemispherical dome in the center and radiating half domes off to the side. Now, the design would change as it passed through the hands of other architects, namely that of Raphael and Michelangelo. Michelangelo is going to add to this design that we will continue to discuss in this class by first simplifying it and beefing it up. He is going to increase the width of the walls and the size of the heavy masonry nearly threefold if you're going to compare the walls. He said they were far too puny to handle the dome that Michelangelo himself would design. And it is this Herculean approach to architecture that is also reflected in his art. Michelangelo will always appreciate a hypertrophied or overly muscular approach to design. All right, so if you look at the rear of the structure, you can see what Michelangelo had designed, including his dome and the sections that were completed. That being, he designed the structure and the facing to have giant or colossal order columns. Right, so these colossal order columns move through more than one story, as you see here with Alberti's facade at San Andrea and Mantua. And you'll notice that he alternates windows, in which one story will have 2 windows, another will have 3. So this is going to lead up to an entablature, which you would have on an ancient Roman temple, and then finally an additional attic story with windows. A very untraditional approach to church design and even the use of ancient Roman vocabulary here. But it is this design that is finished in the 1540s through 60s, and so therefore the rest of the structure conforms to the design around the front, as we will discuss when Carlo Maderno finishes the facade at the turn of the 17th century. Michelangelo Buonarroti is going to be born into an aristocratic family that had come down in the world, and so he wished to be apprenticed as an artist. His father, of course, disapproved given his aristocratic background and beat Michelangelo. Regardless, he relented and allowed the boy to live with the Medici. Specifically, Lorenzo il Magnifico brings the young Michelangelo Buonarroti into his household, where he comes into contact with the Neoplatonic philosophers that he surrounded himself with in the 1480s, including Marsilio Ficino. In addition, he will then be apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, the most prolific painter of the late 15th century, or Quattrocento, as the Italians call it. And Ghirlandaio is going to teach Michelangelo the fresco technique, even though Michelangelo would consider himself, above all, a sculptor, and favoring sculpture over painting, believing that it is a superior medium to work in for artists. Now, the powerful works of Michelangelo as a sculptor and a painter will draw the attention of the warrior Pope Julius II when he is commissioning new St. Peter's as well as his own tomb, and will bring Michelangelo to Rome to help realize his grandiose vision for a renewed Roman Empire. Now, what we need to know about Michelangelo, that unlike Leonardo da Vinci, who absolutely would be considered by today's standards a scientist, even more so than an artist, more specifically, they would refer to him as a natural philosopher, Michelangelo was the opposite. He distrusted mathematics. He distrusted most of the techniques that Leonardo relied on. And remember that Leonardo in his notebooks stated explicitly, "Let no man read my works who is not a mathematician." Instead, Michelangelo relied on what he called giudizio dell'occhio. This is going to be the judgment of the eye, whereby you will make figures look correct, but they actually are not properly proportioned. And that is true for nearly all of his works, whether that be the David we'll discuss, his Pietà, or the Sistine Chapel. They all have optical distortions to make them look appropriate and or heroic or terrifying from a particular angle. Now, Michelangelo is going to work, not just live, but work for over 75 years. That means that he influences not one, not two, but nearly 3 generations of artists. No one in the 16th century, or for that matter, the 17th century, could escape his orbit of influence. You either had to compare yourself to the great Michelangelo or set yourself apart from him. And that's exactly what artists had to do, especially after Giorgio Vasari, writing the famous biographies of these Renaissance artists, places Michelangelo at the pinnacle, at the apex, at the very zenith of the evolution of art. The divine Michelangelo is going to produce the best works. There are none better than him, according to Vasari. This is a daunting figure for other artists who come after him to live up to. Now, this idealization is carried on in another way as Michelangelo's career advances, and that is towards a monumentalization of form, and that's coupled with that idealizing approach. But his figures will become increasingly heroic, monumental, and grandiose in size. The grandeur is going to be one of the most common traits his work from this point onward will have in common. Now, at the Piazza della Signoria today, you're going to find a copy out front of Michelangelo's David that stood there from its completion in 1504 until the 19th century, when it was moved to its location. You can see it today in the Accademia in Florence. Right, that's what you see here on the left is a photograph within the rotunda they built especially for the David, the symbol for the Florentine Republic, as we discussed with Donatello's David and the Medici. Now, originally, it's important to note that some of the distortive qualities that we see in the David, including his elongated torso, his large head, hands, and feet, are all due to, again, just like with the Pietà, Michelangelo's giudizio dell'occhio, his judgment of the eye, preferring to let the optical distortions that one would see be corrected by the elongated proportions he provides. Just as with the Virgin Mary, he conceals the awkward proportions of the figure of the Virgin. In this instance, we need to know that the David originally was meant to be seen from below, very far below its original vantage point for the Florentine Duomo or cathedral, where the sculptures are today, giving you an indication of the type of foreshortening that occurs when looking at something from far below. Now, if you look at, again, the torso, the hands, the head, and the feet, these proportions would be corrected. They would rectify themselves if seen from below. But when Michelangelo heard that they were going to, instead of showing it in its intended location, move it in front of the Palazzo Vecchio in the Piazza della Signoria, he was mortified, for he felt that people would believe he did not understand proper anatomy. Now, people who are familiar with the story of David and Goliath, as we talked about in the introduction, would easily recognize him, even though he is much older than Donatello's version here. We can identify him not only due to his nudity, but more specifically, he's carrying a slingshot that is going to be slung over his left shoulder, held up by his left hand, and he's holding a rock in his right hand that's pressed against his right thigh. The form is going to be closed, whereby the arms close in around him, so we can draw a line literally all the way around the figure, and it remains in one internally proportioned and composed form. Now, we find that in addition to this closed form, which is going to be in a contrapposto pose with all of the weight balanced on the right leg, thus leaving the left leg relaxed. The figure then counterbalances with the hips and the shoulders, right? Then looking off to the left, eyeing his opponent Goliath in the distance, considering the battle to come, and praying, of course, for God to intercede. Now, you cannot see it very clearly when it would have been seen 40 feet or higher up in the air, but very clearly Florentines had no trouble understanding this as David, the future king of the Israelites. Now, the difference between the early Renaissance and the High Renaissance is clearly seen here in the same subject of David, as we still do have a closed form, that being both figures are going to close the arms in around them so that they are not thrusting their limbs out into space and or engaging physically with the environment around them, like later work we will discuss. But there is one major difference. One, we find that even though they are both nude, Donatello's David is more appropriate for his age, for he was too young to go into battle with his brothers, so he would have been an adolescent at the time. Thus he's shown appropriately. Michelangelo's appears to be a young adult, easily in his early 20s, and the heroic musculature of this massive 14-foot tall Il Gigante, as the Florentines would say, is going to be imposing physically. The scale is going to be one of the primary ways in which it communicates the might of David, which so struck a chord with the Florentine Signoria, the ruling government, that they wanted to move it in front of the Palazzo Vecchio to show the power of the secular government, the physical mass and the stature of it representing them. Now, in addition to this monumentality that we find, what is also different from the early Renaissance, with these high Renaissance examples we'll discuss, is that there is a new psychological engagement that takes place. Donatello's David is lost in thought. He is not going to be interacting with anyone outside. He has finished his task, and he has already slew Goliath and decapitated him here, where you have the severed head at his feet. Instead, this is before the battle in Michelangelo's instance. He is eyeing his opponent. He is considering what lies ahead. So therefore, there is a psychological intensity that we can also see in their faces. Donatello's David is serene, calm, expressionless, and we note that it's not looking at or engaging with anything outside of itself. Michelangelo's, on the other hand, very clearly he carves the iris and the pupils to cast very deep shadows, using drill work here to show us that the brow is furrowed and he's eyeing something outside of himself, obviously considering what is to come, being psychologically engaged with what is happening around him. So we know that we have this type of psychological cross-referencing that we discussed with Leonardo da Vinci carried on. In this case, it is implied that there is another figure, and we're not literally seeing others pointed to or engaging with the sculptural ensemble. All right, so where does he get this leonine physiognomy? From imperial portraits. So we find that the drill work used to suggest the deep curls around David's head is the indication that he has a lion's mane, and that he is a great warrior because of it. So if you wanted to show a warrior, you would have this curly kind of mop of a head of hair that comes around the head, right? That suggests it is like a lion's mane, so that they are ferocious, they are fearsome warriors, just like the king of the jungle. In addition, the idea of sharply turning the head off to the side is going. and the rather paranoid, looking over the shoulder, comes from the late imperial portraiture tradition begun by Marcus Aurelius, but seen in examples such as Caracalla, Commodus, and other emperors who are going to show furrowed brows and fiercely looking off to the side, trying to dissuade any would-be assassins from plotting against them. Now, this new monumentality and approach to figural design and musculature immediately came to the attention of Julius II, who was going to be already designing new St. Peter's to establish his legacy. They begin tearing it down in 1506. He invites Michelangelo to Rome under the auspice of actually completing a massive tomb for Julius II inside of St. Peter's. Instead, the tomb project is put on hold, and Michelangelo is given another commission that he is most famous for today. It is at this time, while he's working on that tomb commission, selecting marble, designing the various monumental forms that would make up the eventual tomb, he witnesses the unearthing of the Laocoon in Nero's Domus Aurea in 1506. So this is going to be the model that Michelangelo will return to time and again from this point onward, reusing these forms, as we discussed, as a way in which to capture the heroism that is so important to the High Renaissance, the musculature, the idealized forms, all communicating someone's character, righteousness, or other important virtues and characteristics. So this twisting, muscular form communicates the agony suffered by the Trojan priest in his last dying moments, but it allows Michelangelo to model his own figures on this example, such as in the Sistine Chapel. Now, the Sistine Chapel is going to be given as a commission to Michelangelo when the tomb project of Julius II was put on hold. And it is the best example that we can give you for what we have here in the High Renaissance with the final phase of humanism and the revival of humanism as an approach to philosophy and the arts and even religion, that being a human-centered approach, if you will, to the world. So here we find fully fleshed out, finally, the revival of the heroic antique anatomy that you saw in the Laocoon, brought together with Michelangelo's interest in monumental male nudity. Now, the Sistine Chapel is going to have already been decorated, as we discussed, by later 15th century artists like Perugino, for instance, Raphael's master, who we'll talk about next. So Michelangelo is called in to paint the ceiling, which before was painted blue and had golden bronze rosettes for stars. So he painted over all of that scenes from the Old Testament that run down the center, along with Old Testament prophets and Sibyls along the side, and ancestors of Christ. So we find that we have in one fresco over 5,800 square feet that are actually covered here. There are over 300 life-size and larger figures that are seen 70 feet above the pavement below. So we find that he makes adjustments as he paints so that the visibility of these figures are very clear once he gets to the end, closest to the high altar, which is seen at the bottom here. This is right above the high altar. He begins, of course, all the way back here with the drunkenness of Noah, and then proceeds downwards. Now, the most famous painting from the Sistine Chapel, and arguably one of the most famous and iconic paintings in the world, is the first one where he abandons framework whatsoever in exchange for a massive, open, monumental treatment for the creation of Adam. And it is the creation of Adam which very clearly sums up the values of the High Renaissance and the goals set forth by Julius II for Rome as the new Roman Empire. Right? So we're going to have the moment where God has created Adam, which of course is Hebrew for earth or dirt. He sculpted him out of earth, which we see he is still bound to. So quite literally, he's going to be kept within the boundaries of this primordial landscape on which he lays, unable to support his weight despite his massive musculature and framework, who extends his left arm out, not even being able to support it. It's going to be supported by his knee with a limp finger, which is going to receive at this moment the divine spark of life from God. So he is but a husk at this point, yet to be breathed into by God himself. God the Father is going to be shown here, not in the traditional Jewish or Christian tradition, but taken from Greco-Roman images of gods, especially that of Jupiter, as he flies aloft here with his diaphanous drapery, his long white beard and hair billowing in the air, with wingless angels, that's what these are, supporting him in what has been referred to as a brain-like shape, if you look at the billowing pink drapery that is behind God. Now, with the positioning of these figures, it is important to note that they mirror one another. So this is a summation of what the Renaissance is all about, in that God is going to make man in his image, and so therefore they are positioned similarly, and we are a mirror for God. So this is going to be the Renaissance idea and the humanistic idea that man is a God, or like God, or is God-like in his ability to understand, create, and control the world and his environment. Now, this is, of course, important for ancient philosophy and theories, as well as Christian theology. So remember that the perfect individual, according to the Bible, would make perfect sense, that they would be God-like because they are the closest to the original design God had in mind. So the perfect individual, again, as we discussed with the Vitruvian man, also equals the universe, because God created the universe and is going to, according to the ancients like Vitruvius, put the map for the universe in the proportions of our own bodies. That is, the bodies of the perfect individual, the perfect man, that is. So this is the very essence of Renaissance humanism, that being that man and God are similar if they attain or strive for physical and intellectual perfection. Now, if you look at the figure of Adam, it is obviously modeled on that of the Laocoon in the positioning of the body, the twisting of the head up and to the left, the raising of the, bringing the right arm back towards the body, and then extending the legs outward. Of course, he makes some alterations with the position in order to make it more appropriate for the rather languished pose and sensuous pose of Adam here, as opposed to the anguished pose of Laocoon. But the musculature and the heroism are kept, because this is the first man made in God's image, so he would, of course, be physically perfect. Now, the perfection scene, you'll notice, is a Hellenistic model that we are going to find in many of the sculptures, like the Laocoon and in the papal collection at the time, with very broad shoulders, a broad torso, and very thick musculature. It's hypertrophied in this way, with a small head. Now, you find that there is a woman underneath God's arm and a child that is often referred to either as Eve here under the arm of God, who will be created next in the next scene, or as a virgin and Christ child, because Adam and Eve will cause the downfall of mankind, and then the virgin and Christ will be the new Adam and Eve redeeming mankind. Now, if you look at, interestingly enough, if you haven't considered it yet, the testicles of Adam are actually quite deflated, and his genitalia are very small. It's not surprising that we find a bushel of acorns right next to the scene with Adam. Now, remember that before receiving the spark of life by God, Adam cannot create life himself. So it is commented on at the time by Renaissance commentators that the finger of Adam is very limp, very languid, and that of God is going to be erect and virile. So God is quite literally giving Adam the ability to create life, to give him seed. And it's not surprising that Julius II's family is the Della Rovere, whose coat of arms and heraldic device is an oak tree. So here we have acorns that refer to the descendants of Adam, and that being Julius II. He passes on with the seed just as an acorn grows an oak tree. Now, the contemporary to Michelangelo and one of his main competitors in painting is going to be Raffaello Sanzio. We use the anglicized version of this artist name, Raphael. So Raphael is going to be the opposite of Michelangelo, and he is really unlike Leonardo da Vinci as well. Michelangelo is going to be a devout Catholic. Leonardo da Vinci is, for all intents and purposes, basically an atheist, putting his faith in science. You find that Michelangelo is irascible. He gets in fights with everyone. He is going to pick fights with the Pope himself on several occasions. You find that Michelangelo is believed to be disfigured because he had a broken nose. So we have the myth of the disfigured genius who works alone and doesn't get along with anyone. Raphael, on the other hand, is likable. He's affable, he's good-looking, and we know he's very popular. So he's the exact opposite personality of Michelangelo Buonarroti. So where did he get the training for this? To move fluidly in courts and as a courtier. And the answer is his father raised him in the ducal court Federico da Montefeltro. That being, courtiers from around Europe would be sent to the ducal court at Urbino, where Federico da Montefeltro would train them how to behave in court, much like a finishing school as we would understand it, so that they would blend in seamlessly and impress royalty throughout Europe. This is where Raphael is introduced to Bramante, the architect who would redesign New St. Peter's as we know it and have already seen. But Raphael, even though he is so different from Michelangelo, he will establish the curriculum for the fine arts that we still use in many universities today. Right? So for the next 350 years in academies, this is the academic model for art. You cannot teach someone to see a figure in a block of stone like Michelangelo, but you can teach someone Raphael's a technique of eclecticism. So eclecticism is going to be bringing together characteristics from different sources and combining them into something new. And that defines Raphael's style. He takes from all of the most famous artists. He adopts characteristics from Leonardo, from Michelangelo, from his master Perugino, everyone he comes across, and he combines it and improves upon it. Now, this is all based on the Italian idea of disegno. So disegno, literally translating design, but instead it's an intellectual approach to drawing, whereby you will work out your compositions, right, in an abstract fashion and work through problems on paper. So you find that with disegno, firmly rooted in draftsmanship, Raphael would begin all of his compositions by repeating spiraling forms, then condensing them into Leonardesque pyramids. This is how he's able to suggest the motion and the vivacity and the drama like Leonardo da Vinci, and simultaneously control and contain it with that stable pyramidal composition. Raphael to decorate his apartments, the Vatican stanze, or the rooms, literally, the papal apartments here. So at the same time Michelangelo is painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael is working on the various stanze. So the most famous one being the Stanza della Segnatura, or the Room of the Signature, named as such because it was the papal library and where the Pope signed documents. In this room, we have the 4 epistemological methods for gaining knowledge known in the Renaissance. So each wall is dedicated to theology, or philosophy, or law, or poetry. The most famous of these is going to be philosophy, more famously known as the School of Athens. So it's called the School of Athens because we have a gathering of the greatest thinkers, philosophers, and scientists from all of history, ancient and modern, to the point of the Renaissance. So in this image, you have the monumental approach to architecture that will integrate and will balance these groupings of figures. So many various figures doing different things, involved in different activities, positioned differently. Yet we have a monumental ideal structure here which brings them into focus. And of course, we focus on the architecture, which is going to be a repeated set of art shapes, which get smaller and smaller, drawing our eye back to these 2 figures and framing them in the center. Thus, of course, drawing our eye to the vanishing point in the middle, much like we saw with Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So what we see here is the state of construction of New St. Peter's that was underway at the time, begun in 1506. By the time Raphael begins this 3 years later, we're going to have ground already broken and the central piers constructed, but it was left open to the sky. Now, this is centered around 2 figures in the center, an elderly man and a middle-aged man, and they, of course, hold their works, so we know who they are. One points to the heavens, the other motions down to the earth. These are the 2 greatest philosophers from antiquity, that being the Greek philosopher Plato, who founded Platonic philosophy, and he points upward, indicating his system is based on a notion that perfection is not found here on earth, and we are merely shadows or imperfect representations of the perfect forms that exist in a supracelestial sphere. Aristotle, his pupil on the other hand, founds Aristotelian philosophy, which is going to believe, as he spreads out his 5 fingers, that all knowledge can be found here on earth through empiricism and empirical investigation through the 5 senses. All right, so this represents and separates the scenes into 2 sides. So the people, or the philosophers and scientists, on the side of Aristotle will be known to us as scientists, and of course to Renaissance thinkers as natural philosophers. On Plato's side, we have the more pure understanding of philosophers as we would now know it. So you find that on the side of philosophy, Raphael adds in later, this is one of the late additions, a brooding Michelangelo off by himself, as Michelangelo is considered to be a Neoplatonic philosopher and following the teachings of Plato. On the other hand, Raphael places his self-portrait on the opposite side with the scientists, where we're going to have people like Ptolemy, right, and these other ancient mathematicians. Right, so the groupings, you'll notice, appear quite chaotic and random. But, like the Last Supper, Raphael here is going to organize them. They are all engaged in different activities. No 2 figures are in the same position. Each one engaged in exchanging ideas, right? Theories, theorems, and otherwise, right? Talking to one another. This is supposed to be the greatest collection of thinkers in all of history. Now, this excitement that we see with them getting together and discussing their ideas is also seen in the chaotic positioning of them. They are not lined up very calmly and evenly. They're not seated in nice, neat rows. Instead, they hold globes, they carry compasses, they write their ideas down, they talk to one another. Right? But they are still going to be organized in much the same way that Leonardo da Vinci organized his scenes, to control the chaos, to suggest the drama inherent in monumental, over life-size figures, multi-figural compositions, but then also the harmony of that drama. So we find that the architecture, number one, does a lot to help balance these various groups, breaking them into different sections in the two wings to the side and the central section, which centers around Plato and Aristotle. We also are going to find that they are organized into the same design principle that Raphael uses for everything, and that is ellipses. So he draws in elliptical arrangements, and he designs his compositions in massive ellipses, to where you'll imagine it to be the orbiting path of planets that's going to center around, right in the center of the composition, on Plato and Aristotle. And we find that the groupings are going to also revolve around these larger ellipses. Thus, like Leonardo da Vinci, who is going to bring his composition of the pyramid or the triangle and then the four groups of three, so too are we organizing and controlling this chaos by balancing them on either side, and yet still activating the scene through the use of counterbalancing diagonals seen in the figures, for instance, of Michelangelo and Diogenes, the skeptical philosopher here. The ideal figures placed in an ideal space that does not connect to our own also links it to the monumental wall paintings of Leonardo da Vinci and informs us of the High Renaissance ideals. That being, we have perfect figures in an ideal space outside of our own, engaging very dramatically with one another, showing us the power of human thought and of intellect. So the High Renaissance, especially that begun in Rome, right, or specifically begun by Florentine artists in Florence and then finalized in the final phase in Rome under Julius II, we're going to have monumental, larger than life-size figures, heroic musculature. These ideal figures are going to be integrated into architecture believably. We have not singular, but instead multi-figural compositions that are dynamically organized, focusing on the drama and the excitement of these scenes. And finally, this is all tempered by a return to the grandeur of ancient Rome in sculpture and painting and architecture, thanks to the vision of the warrior pope. This lecture will cover the 16th century in Italy, particularly the areas in the north, especially north of Tuscany. Primarily in Parma, but also in Venice, looking at the developments in art that were different in the north from their central Italian counterparts, and the official counterpart to Michelangelo seen here in Titian. Now, these artists are going to adopt a style that appreciates, like those northern areas of Europe and Germany and Flanders that we covered, landscape, naturalism, and textural illusionism, all of which are going to drive them to a universally adopt oil painting and canvas first. Now, this interest in directly connecting emotionally to the viewer is at the core of Venetian art theory and how it differs fundamentally from that seen in central Italy, primarily Tuscany and Florence, who values disegno, as we discussed it with the case of Raphael, which is organizing intellectually around lines. It is a linear idiom. For the Venetians, they appreciate landscape, but above all else, colore or color. Now, some background on Venice, which is going to find a radical political shift in 1453 because the Ottoman Turks capture the Christian outposts and those trading outposts that Venice held with Constantinople and the remnants of the Byzantine Empire in the east, in modern-day Turkey, for instance. So since Venice no longer had the ability to trade with the East, they were cut off, they looked to dominate and to secure trading routes to the West, to the rest of Western Europe. And so they begin conquering the terra firma, as they call it, or the firm ground, especially the area, the inland bases for the Veneto, as it becomes known, Padua, Treviso, Vicenza, and Verona, where we'll talk about Veronese is going to be from, and where Romeo and Juliet is set. So with these new conquests, they are going to come into conflict with the rest of the European powers, who also are vying for these trading routes, including France and Milan. So you find that Milan and the French are going to control many of these trading routes leading up through France and then to the Atlantic. So this is when we find at the turn of the 16th century, Julius II forming what he calls the League of Cambrai, where all of the major powers in Europe are going to gang up on Venice and attack it simultaneously, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Duchy of Milan to the Papal States to France. All of them are going to engage in a land and naval battle with Venice, but none prevail and none actually conquer Venice until 1797, when Napoleon disbands the Republic, because no one can actually get to the islands, if you remember. Now, the strategic military advantage that the Venetians had is also going to, given the location on water, provide an interest in atmospheric effects and an interest in romanticizing landscape that we discussed previously. They are the first to universally adopt oil painting from Flanders on canvas instead of wooden panels. Right, so this is going to be spread throughout Europe because Venice is going to be built on water, therefore there is high humidity and moisture, and this causes wood to shrink and swell. So painting on wooden panels is not ideal, nor are frescoes, right? Because one fresco is going to require a dry area to be stored in, and if you get moisture or salt on it, like salt water, then it starts to flake off. So it makes perfect sense why the Venetians would appreciate painting oil on canvas, because it is flexible and it is durable around moisture. Now, the pupil of Giorgione, who will become the greatest painter in Venice and synonymous with great Venetian oil painting, is Titian. So Titian is going to be the official painter to the Venetian Republic beginning in 1516, which he holds until his death of the plague in 1576. So this means he has over 70 years of production, much like Michelangelo, and that he is going to influence many generations as well, like Michelangelo. So he is seen and compared to Michelangelo as his rival and his counterpart. And in his art, we can see the two approaches that are very different. Michelangelo, driven by line and that linear idiom with disegno, much like Raphael, whereas Titian and Giorgione and Bellini are going to organize their compositions around emotional devices using color or colore. And that is the difference with Venetian painting. It is emotional, it is intuitive, it is not intellectual. Now, the most famous nude of the Renaissance was also painted by Titian, the so-called Venus of Urbino, because it is going to illustrate the goddess Venus, and it was in the collection of the Duke of Urbino. This painting, produced in 1538, after a famous courtesan in Venice, right, so La Bella Donna here, is going to show a very important model, and is an important model for all nude, reclining, or recumbent female nudes until we get to the modern era. All right, all the way until today, contemporary artists still use this as inspiration or lampoon it, or once again as a touchstone for the ideal female nude, reclining on a bed. Now, the interpretation of this painting relies on the fact that the woman is going to be holding roses in her right hand and with that bracelet. Those interpretations, along with her being nude, suggest that she is the goddess Venus. These are the common markers that symbolize this particular goddess of love and sex. Now, the function of the painting, as she lies positioned, looking coyly up, passively seducing the viewer, can be found in the background, where two maidservants are going to be pulling dresses out of cassone for supposedly this patriarchal woman, or this patrician woman, I should say, to get dressed. So the cassone in the background, importantly, are wedding gifts that are given to women on the occasion of their marriage. And they would place all of their belongings in these chests, much like you would have a closet today. And these would be carried in a procession from her home to her husband's home throughout the city, so that everyone would know she is now married and thus, of course, is no longer marriageable. She is off the market, if you will. Now, inside these cassone, importantly, you often have nude men and women. Both men and women, we should note, because you would open them in the marital chamber during congruous or coitus, because you're supposed to gaze upon something beautiful and arousing to help you conceive beautiful children. The idea being, whatever you look at during the moment of conception, during sex when a woman becomes pregnant, is going to imprint on your soul, thus on the man's seed, and hence it will make a beautiful child. Now, this is important for understanding the Renaissance science of procreation and the difference between eroticism and the function we would understand today of pornography. So in this case, these images are erotic. They function in order to support the production of children, the entire point of marriage and of sex as it is understood by the Catholic Church. Pornography is merely a means to an end, and these are not going to be that particularly. Instead, they are going to help us produce especially a male child, because we have pamphlets of the day, these scientific pamphlets for women, and this is an instruction manual for a married woman, which state that if you're going to, for instance, masturbate before conception, which of course the woman here is in a masturbatory pose, look at her left hand, then that will increase the chances of you conceiving a male child, which is of course the ideal Renaissance family, to have two boys and one girl, right? So one boy you would marry off, right, in an advantageous way to another aristocratic family. The other boy would go into the priesthood to secure you with the church, and the girl you can use to marry off to better your family. Now, looking closely at the Venus of Urbino, we get an indication as to what the Venetians are known for, and that is their use of oil painting and what colore can really do. Colore, which is color in Italian, but more so the Venetian understanding in art theoretical terms, is how color can elicit an emotional response, in this case of erotic love. So we have the soft tresses and locks that cascade of the strawberry blonde hair of the Venus of Urbino, the ideal color for a woman's hair, seen also in the Birth of Venus we already covered, right? But if you look at oil painting on the left and the tempera painting by Botticelli on the right, you can see what oil painting affords, and that is through multiple translucent glazes or thin layers of paint, we can suggest the soft, warm, supple nature of flesh, of skin, in a way that you cannot earlier. We have almost a porcelain doll or ceramic-like effect that seems to be opaque, the opacity of the skin reflecting the light of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. In this case, the Venetians are able to capture, through that use of oil painting brought to them by Flanders, the effect of actual soft skin. It should also be noted that unlike in central Italy, the Venetians will actually use female nude models instead of, like Michelangelo, using a nude male and feminizing it. Now, the last painting we'll talk about is Tintoretto's Last Supper, that, like the Pesaro Madonna, is going to take the viewer's location into account. It is seen here in its original location in situ, that being it was commissioned for San Giorgio Maggiore and still sits in the same frame that it did originally, a very unusual instance. And as you can see here, the only way to view it is at an angle, unless you're inside this chapel. So the sharply foreshortened nature of this Last Supper wonderfully sums up the Venetian approach to painting in the later 16th century that is going to inspire the next generation of artists in the Baroque, much like Correggio would inspire Baroque artists. So here in San Giorgio Maggiore, we have the moment not where Christ is going to state that someone will betray him, but instead he's going to be establishing the sacrament of the Eucharist, as he's going to be handing the bread and once again the wine to his apostles, establishing the tradition for transubstantiation in church services. Surrounding him, you can see the significance of this event as out of the oil lamps are going to appear these images, right? These faint representations of angels that in a ghostly fashion are going to be flying about, showing you that no longer are they just eating bread and drinking wine, but that God's very body will be imbued in this miraculous event. Now, if you look at this massive painting again, right, the Venetians are known for very large paintings later in the century, you can see how Tintoretto, or the man who tints or dyes, because his father was a dyer of fabric, we can see how he paints, and that is very loosely what comes to be known as pittoresco, or painterliness. So he leaves much of his brushstrokes unblended, painting a very dark reddish underpainted layer called the imprimatura layer, and then adding this sketchy-like effects on top of it. Now, we can also tell that it is a very dramatic presentation, not only in the dramatic tenebrism or tenebroso, the dramatic restriction of shadow and highlight, but also the composition. We have dramatic lighting and the composition, which is going to have us flying very quickly back into the far back right section of the painting. So if you follow the orthogonal lines of the floor, the tiles of the floor and the ceiling tiles, and that of the table itself, the vanishing point is technically off-axis, much like we find with Titian's example, far back to the background in the right. But because this is organized around light and color relationships and colore, we know exactly where to look, and Christ is still right in the center of the painting. And we pick him out because he has the brightest halo. He glows the brightest. So it is not through the organizational principles of disegno, like we see with Leonardo, that we read this scene. Right, Leonardo is going to present a very logical painting with the table, right, that the apostles are seated at, parallel to the picture plane. We move through them very logically as we're drawn with the orthogonal lines to Christ's head with the vanishing point. Now we understand the scene through coloristic relationships in a much more dramatic presentation, not an intellectual one. We're not supposed to count the numbers and the numerological associations of the apostles in 4 groups of 3. No, now we're supposed to understand and be brought up and be drawn into this dramatic presentation where angels are flying about, are foreshortened, that are the apostles are glowing, right, in this way. We have the drama all understood by those in attendance, except for those that are serving them who continue on. They do not see the significance. So we are able to pull back the curtain in an apocryphal fashion and see the spiritual actual truth in things. So this is going to be the model for for Baroque painting when we get to it. Modeling, again, dramatic compositions on diagonals with dramatic lighting and dramatic color relationships, all of which draw us in theatrically, not intellectually. This lecture looks at the later 16th century in central Italy specifically with the rise of mannerism, commonly known, which is a very complex and erudite style designed for the elite by the end of the century, and purposefully at times contorted and confusing, yet elegant, graceful, and beautiful nonetheless. The High Renaissance, which begun the 16th century at the outset, was based on classicizing balance with massive, over life-size, idealized forms. This lasted until the death of Raphael in 1520. The interest in a rational, harmonizing, classicizing balance is indicative of this period that believed in and had faith in, through humanism, humans' capacity for reason and rationality. So with the sack of Rome in 1527, we see that the faith that this generation had in mankind's ability to control the universe around him or herself through their intellect and their place in the universe was shaken as well, thanks to the advent of Protestantism, when Martin Luther, the German monk, posted his 95 Theses in 1517 to the cathedral doors at Wittenberg, thus sparking a firestorm of debate on what should be done with the Catholic Church and many of these issues that many saw were prevalent. With all of this confusion and mass hysteria over religious heresy, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor sacking the holy city of Rome and the Pope fleeing, obviously this is going to be the impetus which gives way to, from this classicizing vision, as seen here with Raphael's School of Athens, to one that is confused, that is unsure, that is not clearly spelled out. Thus we see spasmodic rhythms and asymmetrical, cramped, and claustrophobic compositions. And this is known as mannerism popularly, or late Renaissance art in central Italy. So mannerism is most closely tied to and is symptomatic of the Catholic anxiety or the Catholic crisis as it becomes known in Europe, the reaction to Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation. What should Catholics do about this renegade breakaway sect that has formed in Europe? In art, the uncertainty about life and death and spirituality in general is going to be echoed in art, seen here by Jacopo Pontormo in his Descent from the Cross in the Capponi Chapel. Another great example of a painting that is still in situ, like that of Tintoretto's Last Supper we discussed last time. It was designed for this chapel, and thus we still have the roundels surrounding it, as well as the original Annunciation painting you see here on the right wall. This chapel and church that we're going to find at Santa Felicita can be found just across the Arno River as you're approaching the Pitti Palace if you're visiting Florence. Now, the subject, by the title, technically is the same as what we looked at earlier with that Northern Renaissance version of Roger van der Weyden's Deposition from the Cross. The point at which Christ is taken off the cross after he has died on the crucifixion, and from the crucifixion, and we are then going to be moving him to be lamented, and then we are going to bury him, preparing him for burial. That is the stages, supposedly, that we are looking at. And in Roger van der Weyden's, it is very clear that we have a cross, that a helper has just removed the nails from Christ's hands and feet and holds them still in his right hand, so we know what has just occurred. They lower his limp, lifeless, pale body off of the actual cross with a ladder, with Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus supporting him. And we know that we then will lower him to lament his passing. In Pontormo's example of and version of the story, we do not have that type of narrative circumstance spelled out for us. In fact, you might ask yourself, where is the cross on which Christ was crucified? Who took him off of it? Where are we going? And specifically, how are the figures related to one another spatially? Now, the composition, largely a Gothic one, looking to the previous generation before the Renaissance in this type of grandfather effect. We're looking back for compositional devices, stylistic elements, and characteristics in the grandfather's generation, prior to the Renaissance. Right? So you find that the composition is, like the international Gothic paintings we began the Renaissance with Gentile da Fabriano, it is stacked up. So we find that now again up means back as far as space is concerned and spatial organization. So this is a Gothic rendition. In addition to that, if you look at the body of Christ carefully, with these bright pastel colors surrounding him quite illogically, you'll notice that there is no way spatially that the two figures carrying Christ can actually be positioned in the same painting and considered in the same space. For if you look at the kneeling figure who supports the legs of Christ, we know that technically, given his feet being closer to the picture plane, he must be closer to us. But he angles away from us, with the foreshortened legs of Christ moving back into the painting, much as Mary Magdalene in red here rushes to the aid of the fainting Virgin Mary. Whereas the figure behind this one, whose feet obviously are meant to be understood as further back into space, actually presses the body of Christ out towards us in space. Therefore, we have a wonderful juxtaposition that is illogical with these spasmodic jumps in spatial rhythm. Christ must be literally broken in half to have the upper part of his body coming out at us and lower part moving away from us simultaneously. Now, if you look at the directionality of the composition, we also are violating one of the most important rules of classical compositions, and that is the most important figure or element must be in the center. And in this instance, what do we find but a series of juxtaposed hands are in the center? Not the most important figure, not Christ, not the Virgin Mary, not any figure, as a matter of fact. Instead, the composition is much more like a pinwheel that swoops down, as we find St. John the Baptist up here is going to be tilting his body, thus of course leading us down to the figures carrying Christ, and then back in and back up around to those figures that eventually lead us back to the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist, while the artist himself, Pontormo, puts a self-portrait in the background looking on at the illogical, rhythmic, circular composition. In addition to how we move through this painting, we should also note that the color choice is illogical and arbitrary, and is also going to be mixed in a very non-traditional way with the saturation modeling. For if you look at an example such as the figure closest to us in the center on the vertical axis, you'll notice that looking back, the dorsal view that we have here is going to be bright pink, whereas the front of his body is highlighted in a baby sky blue. Right, so this robin's egg blue transitioning to a bright pink is going to be an example of this new approach to mixing colors or hues to make them brighter or duller. And instead of chiaroscuro modeling, whereby if you want to make a color lighter or darker, you would add white or black, with desaturation modeling, you literally desaturate the color by mixing it with other colors instead of just black and white. So we get a serpentine shimmering-like effect with refracted light very often when we have a transition from highlight to shade, such as on the torso of this figure. Now, the last two types of media at the end of the century in painting and sculpture that adopt and carry on mannerism as a style can be seen here with Bronzino first in painting, who, Bronzino meaning the little bronze guy because he was tan or darkly complected. He's going to be the court painter to Cosimo I, the first Grand Duke of Tuscany, ruling over the entire area of the Tuscan region around Florence. So this Grand Duke is going to commission this painting, which is a very complex allegory to communicate the prestige of the Duchy of Tuscany and the talents of his artists being the best in the world. And what we find is this carries on in the second generation of Maniera artists, of Mannerist artists, and further distillation of the complexity seen since Pontormo. So in this, all of the figures are not meant to be taken as historical, literal, or real. Instead, they are all allegories. So an allegorical figure is a personification of an idea or a concept. And they all are pressed up against the surface of this painting with this planar compression. So just like the stacking we saw with Pontormo, with Michelangelo, here we have the further refinement of it at the end of the century. So the figures, we have lost the key that describes exactly what they are, but we have had several great books and articles written trying to guess what specifically is intended by this painting, which is not religious, right? It's of course not showing a Christ child or the Virgin Mary. It's not teaching us a biblical story. Instead, the figures represent ideas. They are the personification of ideas. So you find that Venus in the center is identifiable because she holds in her left hand the golden apple of the Hesperides that she receives from Paris in the judgment of Paris, thus sparking the Trojan War. She is going to be fondled by and kissed by her son, Cupid, who angles his buttocks towards the viewer and is going to grasp his mother's head in his left hand and gently kisses her. We find at the same time Venus is going to be taking the golden arrows from the quiver of Cupid, thus disarming him. Behind, we have a figure which has been identified as Jealousy, which is an old woman who is toothless and screaming, pulling her hair out, with a figure above them to the upper left, representing Oblivion, because the back of her head is missing. She forgets. She is forgetful. In the upper right-hand corner, we find an old man with a white beard, wings, and an hourglass on his back, who is going to be uncovering the figures that are going to be in the foreground, looking nervously at the same time, representing time, old man time, right? Especially obvious because of the hourglass. Below, you have a cherubim, which is going to be holding a handful of roses that's going to be showering the couple in the foreground. So here, this is representing folly, right? So that being you're celebrating something that you should not. So you will see eventually the folly of your ways. Behind him, you're going to have a female figure that has her hands reversed, that being her left hand is on her right arm and vice versa, with the lower half of her body being that of a serpent or reptile. And finally, down below in the foreground right, you have masks. Masks are going to represent deceit because you cover up your true identity when you wear them. Now, to show you how these inventive allegorical figures function, we look at the figure of fraud, for instance, which is where you promise something and deliver another. So we are promising something sweet to eat, the honeycomb, and a beautiful female form, right? An idealized woman at the time. Whereas behind her back, she holds and conceals a scorpion's tail, with the lower part of her body being monstrous, right? So she is a chimerical creature that promises something and will sting you. Now, obviously, the figures are going to be piled up. We move through the scene in a circular fashion. Again, the center, the exact middle of the painting, is empty, just like that of Pontormo. So we move around the figures, around and around, trying to identify them. And that's how this functions, is it's for the King of France. And so you could feel relatively superior intellectually, and as far as your education is concerned, by identifying each one of these figures and piecing this allegory together, whereby we are warning against illicit relationships and the effects of philandering, being sexually transmitted diseases, namely syphilis. It has been noted that syphilis is going to cause lesions in the mind, eventually leading to dementia, hence oblivion in the upper left-hand corner. The figure of jealousy, who pulls her hair out, is going to be suffering from the treatment of syphilis, which is mercury or heavy metal poisoning, which causes your hair to fall out and your teeth to fall out. So all of this is very clearly relating that Cupid, who causes people to fall in love with his golden arrow, has been disarmed. So his mother ensures that he cannot make someone fall in love. Therefore, we have sexual gratification without procreative ends in mind and marital matrimony in mind. So find that if we put them all together, we would say that if love is going to be tainted by, again, fraud and deceit, then time will surely reveal the folly of the lover's ways eventually. So we have to add all of these elements together to come to the conclusion that we are warning against illicit relationships. The last sculptor at the end of the 16th century, who takes over as the court sculptor for the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, specifically for Francesco I, is going to be that of Giambologna. So here in the open-air sculpture garden that we have in the Piazza della Signoria, we have under the Loggia dei Lanzi a series of sculptures. Right? So one of them off to the right is a very beloved and often copied sculpture, the Rape of the Sabine Women. So of course we must be specific here in that the term rape means abduction in art. So you find that Giambologna is going to be a Flemish sculptor that comes from the north. Therefore, his name is Jean de Bouillon, right? It is not Giovanni da Bologna, which is the Italianized version, which becomes collapsed into Giambologna. John from Bologna is what his name means because he designs a fountain there before coming to Florence to work for the Grand Dukes. So here in The Rape of the Sabine Women, we have a very interesting sculptural ensemble with three figures that are going to be made up of an older man at the base, a young virile man in the center, and a young nubile woman at the top. The subject, importantly enough, for the first time that we are aware of, was actually not consequential, in that Giambologna, working with the Grand Duke of Tuscany, is told to make a series of figures, three of them, that spiral upwards into space like an elegant upward-licking flame. That was not intended originally to be anything other than those three figures, representing and showing us the talent and complexity that Giambologna is demonstrating here, having carved these three over life-size figures from a single block of marble, something that had not been done with the size, the sheer size of these figures. They, after finishing it, discussed different titles for this particular work and arrived at the story in ancient Rome where the Romans, needing wives and mothers, invited their neighbors, the Sabines, to a dinner, a lavish feast. And then upon the moment that Romulus, the king of the Romans, is going to announce that all of the Romans should grab and steal the Sabine women, they make off with them. They are meant to take only those women who are unmarried without children. So in this instance, we see the older, supposedly Sabine father watching his young daughter be kidnapped, right, to continue the legacy and the lineage of Romans, to become a Roman wife and mother. So what we have is a very elegant interlocking of figures that spiral upwards that cannot be seen from all the same angle. Instead, you must walk around the series of figures to see the torso and the face of the old man, who's modeled after the Laocoon again, who cringes and pulls up his arm to his face. We can't see the torso or the face of the young man from this angle. We have to walk around it. Nor can we see the rest of the body of the young woman. We must walk around the back of it. Now, we have seen figures lifting others into space before, such as Antonio Palaiuolo or Anthony the Chicken Farmer, such as his Hercules and Antaeus, where Hercules wrestles this giant and son of Mother Earth, Gaia. But you'll notice we can see everything necessary to interpret this work from one angle, from the profile view. We cannot do so with the complicated pose of Giambologna. So if we compare it as well to the High Renaissance, looking at Michelangelo's David, again, this is not even a closed sculpture. The arms, both of the man and of the woman, are going to spiral out into space, thrust out into these various three-dimensional areas, thus activating the space around it as we spiral down and in a counterclockwise fashion up around their bodies until finally we end with the left hand of the woman. In Michelangelo's, again, we can see everything from one angle. We can draw a line all the way around the figure. It does not engage with its environment. So where do we get this idea? We get it from Hellenistic sculpture, whereby figures like the Laocoon twist and contort, forcing us to walk around, seeing what's happening on the sides and around the back of this figure, looking at the snakes that are going to be strangling the priest and his sons. So in the same way, if you look at the actual form of the Laocoon here, just in mirrored reverse, probably modeled on a print, which would have also been reversed to show this elbow up in the air. Not only using the actual form of the Laocoon, but also how we view it. So taken from Hellenistic sculpture. So, in summation, mannerism is the Catholic response to Protestantism, that being what is happening in Europe at the time after 1517 with the advent of Protestantism and 1527 with the sack of Rome, the heart of Catholicism. So this is their response, in which there is no longer a blind faith in our ability to control our destinies, our world, and certainly not the afterlife in our souls. So we see this anxiety carried out in a complexity of narrative, of spatial organization, of compositional arrangement, which returns to Gothic characteristics such as stacking, such as graceful elegance, such as arbitrary color choices that are going to be pastel and very beautiful and elegant, yet not rational, logical, and clear. So finally, at the end of the century, we see in the second generation of Mannerist artists, these erudite themes are going to be designed and intended for an elite audience who would have seen all of these great works throughout Europe, and thus, through interpictoriality, could identify what types of works are being referenced, thus showing their cultured education and how superior they were through the self-referentiality of works of art. This lecture will cover the 16th century in Germany, specifically looking at the developments right before and after the advent of Protestantism, when Martin Luther will begin his crusade against what he perceives to be the failings of the Catholic Church. And we find a different northern idiom adopted in lieu of the Catholic idiom in the south in Italy. Artists such as Albrecht Altdorfer and Albrecht Dürer are going to rise and come to prominence as very popular painters in what we now call Germany, but at the time was the Holy Roman Empire. So in a map of Europe at the time in the 16th century, the 1500s, we find it rather deceptive because it appears as though Spain and Portugal, France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire are one contiguous geopolitical unit, when in fact this is not the case. The Holy Roman Empire remained a fragmented set of principalities nominally ruled over by the Holy Roman Emperor. So these regional loyalties to dukes and these rulers in Bavaria, right, Saxony, Prussia, right, Lombardy, these areas in the Holy Roman Empire would be ruled over by a very strong local lord, who then paid fealty to or loosely had ties to the Holy Roman Emperor, whose power came from the Pope in Rome. It is in these loosely tied together areas that speak different dialects of German that we find a very important set of inventions and ideas that would spread throughout all of Europe originating. And that is, we have the development of the printing press, we already see by mid-15th century, as well as printmaking, and the new ideas coming out of Germany challenging the primacy of the papacy is going to find Protestantism spreading incredibly rapidly, thanks largely to the invention of these two technical innovations that allow the spread of ideas incredibly rapidly across vast geographical distances. Now, the ideas that would come to reshape the world as we know it today would come first from the German monk Martin Luther, who, remember, in 1517 is going to publish his 95 Theses, thus asking for the reconsideration of certain transgressions on the part of the papacy, according to Martin Luther. And these are all his complaints. Thus, we find Protestantism, or the protest, in order to reform the Catholic Church, gives us the term the Protestant Reformation. Now, there are different varieties of Protestantism, or different ways to protest Catholicism, if you will, and the complaints that they had. Each one of the 95 Theses is an individual complaint that Luther had, such as the selling of indulgences or the selling of church offices, right? Things that he found to be unethical and certainly immoral. But the different varieties of Protestantism we'll review today. The more mild version is going to be that practiced by Luther himself as he founds Lutheranism, which is going to maintain many of the sacraments held sacred by the Roman Catholic Church today. Other thinkers, such as John Calvin, are going to more radically break with tradition and are going to, for the sake of our class today, put forth ideas that are anti-art and thus demand the destruction of religious idolatry. And this is known as Calvinism. You probably most famously are familiar with Calvinism because of the idea of the predestination of the believer. Now, these ideas are going to split Europe in half and lead to 200 years of almost constant war, the most famous of which, of course, aside from the northern wars around the Netherlands in the late 16th century, are going to be followed by the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. Regardless, these religious wars are going to cause widespread unrest as different regions try to grapple with whether or not they should remain Catholic and or convert to Protestantism. And we see most of these happening in the Holy Roman Empire, that being modern-day Germany, Austria, northern Scandinavian countries, and then Switzerland. And then it happens, of course, most violently in the Netherlands, somewhat in France, but especially in England, where we have Henry VIII founding the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, as you might know it, breaking his ties with Roman Catholicism and the Pope because he wanted to get a divorce and remarry. So this is going to set Europe apart from one another and against one another. And if you look at a map of Europe, right, during the Reformation, what's happening when half of Europe is going to reject Catholicism and adopt a new version of Christianity, you can see that it largely is going to be maintained today. For if you look at England, which is still the Church of England today, it's all Protestant. If you look at Northern Ireland, where England controlled it, that still is Protestant to this day. The rest is Catholic to this day. And then if you look at northern Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, as well as Scandinavia, they are still Lutheran today. Whereas in southern Germany, in areas such as Bavaria, you're going to find that they are still Roman Catholic today. So we see the religious map of Europe is going to be set by the mid-16th century. Now, the significance when it comes to works of art and material culture for the Reformation is quite staggering, in that in Germany, because they are iconodules, or they love images, we keep images in religious worship. Luther stated that images were necessary and did function as Bibles to the illiterate. For people who cannot read, they can see the stories of Christ and the apostles as an example for them to live their lives. However, in areas that adopted the more radical versions of Protestantism, such as the Netherlands, you find that they will practice iconoclasm. And these iconoclasts, those who literally break images, are going to riot, running through churches, especially in the north and the Netherlands, breaking statues, burning paintings, and causing widespread chaos amid these purges as they see them, trying to purge their holy structures from the idolatry of Catholicism, and they whitewash them. So if you go to Amsterdam, for instance, today, in areas in the north, right, in Holland, or the Dutch Republic as it was known, you will see the interiors of the churches. All they did was take these previous Catholic churches, like St. Bavo here in Haarlem, and whitewash the walls, stripping it of all of the religious imagery you would have seen. And this is the origin of the difference between Catholic and Protestant churches today. There are variations, but by and large, if you go to a Catholic church, you're going to have decorations such as seen here on the left of Santa Maria della Vittoria, where you will have paintings and sculptures, and then wall murals. We have stucco angels here, floor to ceiling. In a single church, you could have nearly 1,000 individual works. Whereas in Protestant churches, we are banning religious imagery for fear of violating the second commandment, right? So thou shalt not have any graven images. Now, this slow rejection is, of course, also going to be seen ever so subtly in Isenheim, in one of the most famous surviving altarpieces from the 16th century in Germany, still made for a Catholic church in a monastery that specializes in skin disease and also doubles as a hospital. So at Isenheim, in a very small monastery that is removed from an urban area still today, you're going to find Matthias Grunwald, who was commissioned by the monks of this hospital and a monastery to paint the Isenheim Altarpiece, named as such for the city in which it was created. So in 5 years, we have a splendid altarpiece that is going to be a polyptych that opens twice, not just once, which has a crucifixion scene on the exterior and a lamentation below, with saints on either side flanking them. And then open it up and find a very colorful, right, very promising invitation to the life of Christ. In summation, at the left, we're going to have the Annunciation, which promises the incarnation of God. Then we have an angelic choir that's going to be singing and playing the musical instruments for the Virgin Mary and Christ child as God looks on. And then in the far right, we're going to have the resurrection of Christ. All right, we open this polyptych and these wings again, or a second time, a second set of wings fold out, and you find we now have a polychromed readable or series of sculptures on the final interior, with again the Christ and apostles below in the predella, with the panels folding out, revealing episodes from the life of these two plague saints. Now, looking at them individually and more slowly, we find that the choices of saints, such as Saint Sebastian and Saint Anthony, are not accidental. And so you must always ask why certain saints are chosen. And generally, if they're going to be next to a donor portrait, they're chosen because they are the patron saints of the people that pay for it. However, in this case, there are no donor portraits, so we know that they are in fact plague saints, who you would pray to if you were sick, specifically with the plague, but in this case we have the monks of this monastery treating people inflicted with a very specific illness, right? A very specific type of skin disease. So Saint Sebastian, you remember, is going to be tied to a column, sometimes shown tied to a tree and shot up with arrows. And then Saint Anthony on the right is going to be a hermit saint who lives out in the desert, and God sends demons to torment him, as we looked at with the engraving by Schongauer of St. Anthony tormented by demons. So on the interior, as we fold open the polyptych twice, you get a good indication as to how we should use this altarpiece and to whom it was directed, because we are going to find that hospitals, or ospedale, in the early modern era are not a place one goes in order to be cured. Hospitals are places you go to die. So you would receive your final unction or your last rites, as we now understand it, overseen by monks in the last hours of your life. And this is what you would look like, just to show you St. Anthony being beaten by numerous terrifying demons, as a figure looks on, stricken by ergotism, otherwise known more popularly as St. Anthony's fire. And here we have St. Anthony himself enduring ungodly amounts of pain. So if you look at the figure in the lower left-hand corner, who is falling back, much like St. Anthony is as well, with his left hand down, grasping, right, once again, this book, as you'll see the figure, has nothing to do with the narrative and the story of the life of St. Anthony. Instead, if you look carefully at this figure, who is stricken by gangrene and has these pustules erupting with these pussy blood-like substances oozing from them, you find that this is what the sufferers of the skin disease known as St. Anthony's fire would look like. Because, of course, you find that in eating bread that had been tainted with fungus, this is an issue we still have today in many areas, then you would find the sufferer would start developing lesions, and eventually their limbs would become gangrenous, requiring them to be amputated. And so you see what it would look like, the people who are witnessing the suffering of St. Anthony, but the promise that as we are suffering as well, we can overcome, right? Instead of renouncing God, as the demons are trying to get St. Anthony to do, he resists. He is strong in his faith. And we see that as well in the body of Christ when the altarpiece is closed. For this Christ, taken from a description of St. Bridget of Sweden, is going to be mangled and be gangrenous himself, be broken on the cross. As the description from St. Bridget tells us, you see blood pouring from his mouth. We see the lesions from the crown of thorns digging into his skin. We see the torn flesh as he was flagellated on the column. And then even in his hands and feet, you see see the nails twisting and contorting, breaking and fracturing these bones. This is not unlike that appreciation in Germany that we saw with the Röntgenpietà for psychological realism, to not overlook the brutal aspects of this type of crucifixion and execution, but instead using it for meditative and an empathetic device for those that pray to Christ to see how he actually physically suffered. Because we ourselves are physically suffering, and it should come as no surprise that when you open this altarpiece, it's going to sever the right arm of Christ and his legs. It has been pointed out that sufferers from St. Anthony's fire with gangrenous limbs would also have these limbs amputated. But that is okay, because we are promised salvation. And if we open the altarpiece and look at the exterior, which shows suffering and death, we, like Christ, are promised a new body. And if you look at the flesh of this resurrected Christ on the interior right panel in the middle position of this polyptych, you will notice that his body seems to dematerialize. It is immaterial. It is almost made of light. Thus, of course, even though our limbs must be amputated and we might be a paraplegic, it is fine, because if we trust in Christ, right, and follow the sacraments in our final hours here, we will get a new body. We are promised this in the next life. And we see that very clearly in the figure of St. John the Baptist, who does not belong at the crucifixion scene. He was decapitated thanks to the dance of Salome in front of Herod 6 months earlier. But he is there, speaking in Latin, with the Lamb of God bleeding into a chalice, representing symbolically Christ, who bleeds from his side as well, from the wound inflicted from the Roman soldier Longinus. And you find that St. John the Baptist here, pointing to him, says, "As he increases, so I must decrease." Thus, the way to salvation is literally being pointed out to us in our final agonizing hours here in a hospital. Now, we find that here in Nuremberg, the city of intellectual life, publishing and printing, the home of Albrecht Dürer, and certainly of great philosophers who will come through, like Erasmus of Rotterdam, we're going to have the Leonardo of the North, who will travel to Italy, getting the ideas from the Italian Renaissance, and then bringing them back, importing them to Germany, right? Sharing in this endeavor that seeks to understand the world through humanism, through a revival of classical texts, through an investigation of the natural world. So in traveling to Venice, specifically in 1494 and 1505, Durer seeks to bridge the gap between the North and the South, between the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical Roman and Greek antiquity in Italy, and bringing that together with an interest in northern naturalism and landscape that is appreciated in Germany. He is also, importantly, going to be the inventor of the copyright. So because he is going to be a printmaker, and he makes most of his money from printmaking, we find that his works are often copied by competitors. So he's going to receive permission from the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian in 1506 to have his copyrighted signature AD, of course a double entendre for Albrecht Dürer and Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, right? So we'll always have his signature and the date associated with it. You will know when it is an authentic Dürer, and if someone tries to copy this, he can then sue them. Now that's how Dürer is able to move forward woodcutting. If you turn to his engraving, you have another example of how he is able to take from and build on earlier developments by people like Martin Schongauer in his Torment of St. Anthony, and is able to advance this textural differentiation and illusionism in engraving, and thus communicate and spread all over Europe that he is a master engraver, and he's also a master of anatomy. So here we find in his fall of man, which is illustrating the biblical story of where Eve eats from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then gives the fruit to Adam, thus leading to the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. We have a northern forest here, seen instead of a lush jungle, for instance. We are to understand this as the Garden of Eden because perched on the branch supporting the plaque, which says Albrecht Dürer Noricus Facebat 1504. Thus Albrecht Dürer, this northern artist, made this in 1504 with his signature AD. Perched on that branch, you also have a parrot. Remember that parrots represent wisdom, right? And this wisdom is going to be representing the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So you find that the serpent here is going to be handing Eve with her right hand, accepting it, this fruit, who Adam extends his left hand to also receive it next from the first woman. So the figures of Adam and Eve, importantly, are classically proportioned from that of the ideal man and woman from classical statuary. So you find that learned observers who would purchase this engraving were meant to understand the sources for these poses, being that of the Apollo Belvedere in the Vatican collection and the Medici Venus. So you find that each one of these represent ideal masculine beauty and feminine beauty. And of course, the first man and woman being made in God's image and perfect would best capture these ideal proportions as they are understood at this time. Now, to show that we have perfect balance, right, between man and woman, we have a harmony between man and God in the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve are going to disobey God. We also can see this in the ancient and medieval science of the humors, in which the humors also represent balance and health. So there are 4 humors representing the 4 liquids that make up our body that, when in balance, are going to represent emotional health and happiness. They are going to be blood, phlegm, or of course we understand snot, yellow bile, and black bile. So these are the liquids that make up our bodies, believed since Galen and Hippocrates in antiquity, that doctors would try to balance. And if you were sick, it means that you had too much of one of these. For instance, if you have a cold or a flu and have a lot of phlegm, obviously we need to introduce the opposite, something that's hot and dry, in order to get rid of that lethargic liquid. So you find that these 4 humors are represented by 4 animals: a rabbit, an ox, a cat, and an elk. So each one of these you see below and behind these figures that are all living in harmony. Even the cat down in the lower foreground is looking at the mouse whose tail is being stepped on by Adam. So we know that, like the goat balancing precariously on the cliff to the top right of this engraving, that in the next moment, when Eve and when Adam take a bite of this fruit, that it will cause the fall of man. The goat will fall off this precipice, off this cliff. We find that the cat will start eating the mouse. Animals will start devouring one another. That chaos is going to be instituted into this perfect, hermetically sealed environment. Now, if you look closely at the textures that Durer is able to capture in this engraving, you will note that he uses both the parallel hatching technique common in Italy to suggest the muscular skeletal system underneath the skin, but he also is going to use the cross-hatching technique that we talked about with Schongauer, common in the north, that is able to communicate texture more effectively. So the rough hide of the elk, or the soft fur of the cat in the foreground, the feathers of the bird, all are suggested by cross-hatching. But the combination shows us that Durer is interested both in showing us that he is a master of anatomy, right? Just like Antonio Palaiuolo in his Battle of the Ten Nudes was meant to suggest the ideal anatomy that Palaiuolo mastered after dissecting corpses and that Italians were known for. Now Durer also states that as well Germans can master the anatomy like Italians, so he is as knowledgeable as these Italians. But he can go further and combine this with the northern interest in surface description and textural illusionism. This lecture will look at what happens after the Protestant Reformation in France, Spain, the Netherlands, and England in the later 16th century. After we discussed Germany last time, we will see that the Catholic nations that remain so, that being France and Spain, will move in one direction, keeping close ties with the classicizing style coming out of Italy, the home of the papacy. Whereas the Netherlands and England will pursue a new style that does not necessarily have overt religious imagery, but appreciates landscapes and textural illusionism that was a holdover from the 15th century with late medieval symbolism involved within it as well. Now, the interest in Italianate fashion, which dominated France, will also find its way into Spain, because the 16th century is going to be the height of Spanish power, and in order to communicate their newly regained territory and the new country as we would understand it today of Spain, the Spanish are going to use the Renaissance idiom and style that comes from Italy to communicate the same imperial connotations that Julius II was looking to communicate, that being from ancient Rome. Now, it is at this time that we find Spain is not only going to control what we understand today as modern-day Spain, but also it will inherit the Netherlands in the north and Flanders. It also is going to have a branch of the Habsburg family ruling over Austria. So we got the Austrian Empire over here as well, and they will rule the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily along with Sardinia. So this is the greatest geographical extent that the Spanish Empire will have, especially with the conquest to the New World begun by Christopher Columbus in 1492. And it is the same year, in 1492, that we find the Reconquista concluding, that nearly a millennium of fighting to expel the African Muslim Moors from Spain has finally concluded, that being 800 years of fighting and constant warfare to expel these Muslims that set up first the Umayyad Caliphate, if you remember from Survey 1. Now, those that were left over in Spain offered to convert, but the Spanish expelled even those Christian converts, not trusting them, which makes sense if you consider that Spain had seen these foreign powers and these foreign rulers as an external invading force that they wish to purify and expel from their Christian lands. So you find that it is until 1588 that Spain will be the most powerful nation in Europe. We forget this. It's not until the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 by the English that we see their dominance curtailed and coming to an end. Now, because of the unique circumstances that Spain is going to be born under, that being fighting for 800 years straight in order to expel what they see as an heretical invader to their country, they have the most corrupt administration. They are least tolerant of unorthodox religious beliefs, and so you find that Jews and Muslims, even the ones that agree to convert, who had been living there for generations and generations, were still expelled to Africa, right? So we find that it is not surprising that it is in this time and place that the Spanish Inquisition will be founded with permission by the Pope to Queen Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1478, in which they have their own state arm of the Inquisition, which is separate from that reports to the papacy. So we must must remember that when considering the grotesque tortures and what was carried out under the name of the Spanish Inquisition. It was for the King of Spain, not for the Pope in Rome. The king at the time, who needs to assert himself and to establish a new capital, is Philip II. So Philip is a very popular name among Spanish kings that we will see leading up to the 30 Years' War and even into the 18th century. So Philip II here rules until 1598, and he will adopt a classical Italianate idiom that comes to be known as the unornamented style, or the estilo disornamentado. The unornamented style, right, is going to be a severe version of Italianate classicism, stripped of flourishes and excessive decoration as the Spanish would see it, which is a wonderful metaphor for how the Spanish see themselves and their rule, as uncompromising, as not complicated, as straightforward. They are Orthodox Catholics, and that is all. Now you find that until this point, there had been no fixed capital. So even though in 1492 Spain as we know it comes into being, it is not until 1561 that there is a fixed capital in Madrid, that being a place where the king is going to be located and his court is going to surround him. Now that is going to be here at the El Escorial, where he's going to patronize especially Venetian artists. The Spanish really appreciate the straightforward textural illusion and interest in textures that the Venetians are going to specialize in, and what they can do with oil painting. And so a series of poesia are made for the Spanish king by Titian. And they would have been housed here in the Capitol building of El Escorial. So the building, the Capitol, which includes the living quarters for the king, a main church to show the unification of church and state, and the rooms for all of the servants and the courtiers, with this unornamented style, was designed by Juan Bautista de Toledo and Juan de Herrera. These artists had traveled to Italy to study, and their designs are going to express just that. In this Italianate geometric clarity common among Renaissance palaces, much like we saw at the Chateau of Fontainebleau for Francis I, you will notice that we have a bilaterally symmetrical composition whereby we can transect this plan down the middle and it folds over relatively equally, all surrounded by and coming to a head with the church and the dome for this church, showing that there is no question that the religious center of Spain is going to be paramount. Now here we have the facades that would have inspired the architects, especially Herrera, who spent over a decade, 12 years in Italy, absorbing the architecture of his contemporaries. I show you as an example here the Chiesa Nuova, that's going to be a very standard Baroque facade, which is two-storied, that's going to have engaged columns below, generally with flat and engaged pilasters above. So here we have the engaged columns in this temple front. You have your standard entablature, much like we have seen in other examples such as Palladian architecture. And then you're going to have a pediment above. In this case, it's on top of a second series of engaged columns. But you'll notice, even though we have the two stories, we have the columns and entablature running down the center and a pediment at the apex of the entrance to El Escorial, that it is stripped down, that it is not as ornate. There are less sculptural flourishes and decorations. The columns, you'll notice, are going to be Doric order on the bottom and Ionic order on the top, much like with the Colosseum moving from one to the next. Whereas in the Italianate version, you'll notice they use the Corinthian order, much more decorative flourishes and elements. So this estilo discernimentado is going to represent the Spanish monarchy in general and how their reach of power is global at this point, much like the Roman emperor. So they are going to adopt these stripped down, reserved, and grave images from the Roman Empire and its architecture. Now, turning to the north, the Spanish will also be very influential in the development of the most Protestant of all nations, the most radically Protestant, and that's going to be the Netherlands. So turning to the Netherlands, we should note that in 1477, the Duchy of Burgundy will be divided with the death of the last duke. So you find the duchy divided into 17 new provinces will come under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V will bequeath this part of his kingdom at his death to his relative Philip II, who's the King of Spain, in 1579. So in 1579, the Spanish, being incredibly Catholic and rigid in their belief systems, are going to levy heavy taxes and persecute Protestants now under their rule. This leads to a revolt in the Protestant North. So you find that the Protestants are going to, as we already discussed, riot, run through churches, ransacking the images that Mother Church commissioned in the sculptures and the paintings that were sent there. That for the Dutch are seen not so much as violating the second commandment of idolatry, but representing the tyranny of the Spanish who are trying to control them. So when they rise up and overthrow the Spanish rulers in the north, we see the modern states of and the modern territories of the Netherlands or Holland in the north remaining Protestant, whereas the south, closest to France, which is a Catholic nation, will remain Catholic, being called Flanders in this period, but eventually being renamed Belgium as we now know it. So we find that in the south, we find biblical scenes are going to be retained in religious imagery for churches because they are Catholic. However, in the north, we find that these religious scenes, these biblical scenes, will be replaced and will not show overt religious imagery, and instead will develop new ways in which to moralize or to communicate social belief systems to keep people in check socially. And that's going to be through genre scenes or scenes of everyday life and landscapes. But we find that the North was not always Protestant. Turning to Hieronymus Bosch, probably one of the most famous Dutch painters before the Protestant Reformation, we have here in his Garden of Earthly Delights a continuation of that Catholic tradition of having polyptychs that open and close with winged panels. So here, in a Last Judgment type, we have the creation of the earth, the separation of light and darkness, the separation of water and land, and the creation of the first organic life shown from the book of Genesis with the wings closed, painted in grisaille, just like we saw with the Portinari altarpiece and the Ghent altarpiece. It will have in the north a black and white painting on the exterior. So here we have the understanding of the earth. They, of course, did understand the universe to be a sphere. That is not new. Just the area where we inhabit, though, is going to be flat. Above, you have the dome of the heavens, as seen here, with God the Father outside of this dome of the heavens, creating from outside of existence itself. And then we have the underworld below, right? So this is where you have Hades or hell. That is the Greek conception of the cosmos, which gets carried on by Christians in the Middle Ages. When we open it, we see a very colorful, very vibrant set of paintings in this triptych, which is going to be very much like the Ghent altarpiece, the Isenheim Altarpiece, and others that has a rather bland exterior, yet promises something very colorful and lively on the interior. And in it we have three different seasons: springtime, summer, and winter, shown illustrating the Old Testament and what happens to the descendants of Adam and Eve, and then our eventual last judgment and punishment as we are cast out into hell as sinners. So starting with the Garden of Eden in the leftmost panel, moving left to right as we read a sentence, we're going to have the creation of Eve. So we find that Adam has already been created, and now God, or Christ as God here, is going to be presenting Eve, who is just made from the side of Adam, to be his helpmate. So we find that we already see that original sin is going to cause chaos and widespread destruction from the outset. There are already issues as animals are devouring one another. You can see this feline-like creature eating a rodent off to the side. This duck-billed bird is eating a frog, right? So we find that they're already devouring and attacking one another. Here a frog is ripped apart by two birds. So we find that this violence is going to continue in this hedonism in the next scene. And remember that Bosch is going to be known for his bird's eye views as we are hovering above the scenes with the diminutive figures carefully rendered in oil paint below, with these fantastical creatures, none of which are meant to be understood to reference real living creatures. Since you have three-headed birds, for instance, you're going to have these pygmy albino giraffes and unicorns, for instance, over here. Very fantastical imaginations. In the center, we have the descendants, or otherwise those that are going to be in the days of Noah, being thus it was in the days of Noah that we have lustful and unchaste behavior. Now, this is mentioned in the Old Testament, but Matthew, in chapter 24, verses 36 to 39, will connect the notion of the deluge, the great flood of Noah, to the last judgment. So once again, we are to understand this as how we will all be judged for our sins. So what do we see here in the so-called Garden of Earthly Delights? The central panel, of course, is where this massive altarpiece gets its name. For what is delightful, but we have dozens upon dozens of these nude figures, these couples that are engaged in lustful hedonistic behavior. So we have the men riding bareback these animals, these pigs, bulls, and horses, jumping on them in acrobatic displays around this pool, where we have women with cherries and fruits balanced on their heads. Fruits always representative of, once again, fertility and of sexual lasciviousness. So we have here these animal instincts and hedonism are literally carried out, in which we have human beings acting and behaving like animals. This one riding a griffin, for instance. This one using a fish as a jousting lance, right? So all of them are going to be indulging in appetite, whether that be fleshly and or through food, like you see right here. However, none of them are technically in a position for a sexual congress, save one example. But the idea of men riding animals in order to court women goes all the way back in history. We have examples of these elaborate acrobatic feats with bulls from the Minoan civilization, for instance, as we discussed in the first survey, and or surviving until this very day with bullfighting, for instance. Now, the pleasures that are going to be enjoyed in the central panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights give way to torment in the final section as a Last Judgment scene, as cause and effect is carried out. Because these individuals were hedonistic and sinful, they are going to be tormented in this fiery landscape, much like Sodom and Gomorrah, burning in the background here, with the giant tree man Odeth, right, dominating the middle ground, and then the bird-headed Satan on his throne in the foreground to the right. So just to show you details of the two figures that dominate the scenes of torture, you're going to have the tree man Odeth, who is hollow, whose legs are going to be suspended on boats floating in this lagoon, showing you that whatever you enjoyed in life becomes your torment in death. So if you enjoyed music and dancing and once again engaging in adultery, then you will be forced to dance with demons forever tormented. If you were wrathful, right, and enjoyed inflicting pain and or killing, then you yourself will be ripped apart by wild animals or run through in the afterlife. The torments, of course, that are carried out again and again generally involve sexual torments or the insertion of different objects into the anus. We see that in several examples here. You can see musical instruments, for instance. If you indulge in music too much, then you're going to have flutes that are inserted into your anus, or you're placed inside a drum with demons beating you. So trying, as always, to drown out the sound or placed in these musical instruments. Down below, you find that if you were vain, you are going to be molested by demons looking at yourself in the mirror in the posterior of this demon right here. Or if you are going to be greedy, you find that you will be forced-fed golden coins, right, or excrement, and you will vomit them back up into this lecherous sewage latrine here. While the giant birdman Odeth, just like the blue Satan in Giotto's Last Judgment, devours souls and defecates them out below. In this case, birds flying out of the rectum of this poor soul. What is appropriate, even though this might seem entirely fantastic and whimsical and maybe even heretical, is that it still corresponds with Catholic beliefs and the Catholic idiom in that the punishment will fit the crime, especially related to the 7 deadly sins. So this is just a much more fleshed out version of the different torments which one could see in hell, given the various grotesqueries and the nature of man's sinful nature. Now, after we are going to see the spread of new ideas, we slowly see a shift and the evolution of genre scenes. So genre scenes literally are scenes from everyday life that are going to illustrate moralizing themes, but not with religious imagery, not with images of stories from the Bible, but instead show everyday people engaged in everyday activities and reinforcing moralizing stories within it. Here you're going to have Quentin Messias and the money changer and his wife. So the money changer we see in a scene that any of us could possibly see in a port city in the north, right, around the Netherlands, whether that be, again, Amsterdam or that be Delft, right? So these port cities where you would get off and then you would have to exchange your money just like you do today if you're traveling to Europe and you need to exchange to the euro. At this time, there is no standardized paper money. All of the coins are made of actual precious metals, silver, right, copper, gold. So you would have to exchange the exact weight from one realm to another, and one weight of silver to another. So that's what the money changer is doing here, is weighing the coins to make sure that his weights are going to be just and he does not cheat people. His wife, sitting next to him, was looking at a book of hours, as you can see right here, a prayer guide for the different times of the day, and she then is distracted by the money, who then is going to look away from her prayer guide and instead focus on the material aspects of life down here. You probably can already begin to guess the moralizing message at play here, but there's more. On the frame, even though this is not a religious scene, it's going to illustrate the biblical underpinnings by quoting from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 36. So the frame states, "Let the balance be just and the weights equal. Hence, do not cheat people and be balanced in your life as you will be judged with a scale in the afterlife." Behind the couple, to the right in the background, you have 2 old men that are going to be gossiping. So gossiping is going to be a sin in the North that was considered to be much like the devil's hands are going to find their way into those who are idle. So it's believed that if you are going to be standing around and not productive and not producing things, being idle and just spreading gossip about your neighbor, that was a destructive force that is continually reinforced in these moralizing paintings in the North. Now, if you look at all of the accoutrements in the background, they are all symbolic. And the symbolism is very subtly pointed to in this mirror, right? This convex mirror on the table in front of the couple, which is reflecting us, the person who is waiting for his money to be exchanged. And out the window, you'll notice we find there is a church steeple. So what should you be doing instead of focusing on the materialistic aspects of life? You should be going to church, considering eternal life, considering the spiritual in the world and not just the material. Now, this idea of showing a mirror that reflects what is outside of the painting goes back to Jan van Eyck and his so-called Arnolfini wedding. And just like the Arnolfini wedding, every object in this image is symbolic as well. So we find that they still appreciate in the North infusing symbolism in the everyday. That being, we have fruit representing fertility in the background on the shelf. You have, again, this clear vessel. Remember that the clear vessel is always going to represent the virgin's womb. So just like light passing through this vessel, so too did God, in the form of the Holy Spirit, enter into the womb of the Virgin Mary, creating Christ incarnate. Finally, you're going to have other examples like this candle, which is burned down and extinguished, which represents, again, our lives. It's another memento mori, in that we, like candles, are going to burn brightly and quickly, but eventually fade and extinguish. So our light will eventually be extinguished. We will all die. So all of the symbolism is still going to be encoded in these paintings, but it's not overt. It's not very clear in the sense that we are showing an actual scene from the Bible. And this is what they will continue to develop in the North with artists